think we're live now. So good day to everyone and welcome from wherever you may be joining us. My name is Noemi Denau Schroeder and I'm with DII. I'm pleased and honored to be moderating this session titled Blended Finance for Women's Economic Empowerment, Best Practices in Leveraging Catalytic Capital. Joining me on this virtual stage are three accomplished and engaging women who are working at the forefront of gender equity and financial inclusion from different angles. We have Diane Eisenberg, founder and managing director of Kennyarth. Kennyarth is an impact-first family office investor focused on funding market-based solutions that benefit underserved communities. Kennyarth engages globally, primarily in rural areas, with an emphasis on sectors such as agriculture, affordable housing, financial inclusion, and energy access. Gwen Schneider is the private sector engagement and women's economic empowerment advisor at USAID. Gwen brings over a decade of experience collaborating with private sector entities to advance gender equity and women's empowerment. She's implemented programs in Bolivia, Brazil, and Chile, with a focus on entrepreneurship and socioeconomic impact. And lastly, we have Deborah Schwartz, Managing Director of Impact Investments at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Deborah leads MacArthur's Impact Investment Program, which has invested over $700 million to advance inclusion, equity, and innovative solutions to social, economic, and environmental challenges. Before joining MacArthur, Deborah served as CFO for a nonprofit child welfare agency and a public finance investment banker. She's also been a past presidential appointee to the U.S. Treasury Department Community Development Advisory Board. So today's panel will touch on three areas. We'll look at examples of how catalytic capital is being employed by these different organizations, explore some of the tensions that exist between blended finance and social inclusion, particularly as related to women in underserved communities. And finally, explore with our panelists how they and their organizations are contributing to broader systemic change. We want to promote as lively discussion as possible in this virtual space. So I've asked our panelists to please, intercede and add on to what some of your other fellow panelists have said. And also to those who are listening, please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we'll come back around to those at the end of this main discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to get started, and we'll kick off this first question on catalytic capital to you, Deborah. So to get started, as you've been quoted as saying, and I found as I was looking at some of the blogs that you've written, you said, and I quote, "The most compelling impact investments are often made, not found. And catalytic capital is that essential made, not found piece of the puzzle." Can you please elaborate on that quote and share with us an example of your work from a gender lens perspective?
Happy to. Thank you, Noemi, and thank you, GEFI, and everyone, USAID, that has made today's conversation possible. It is truly wonderful. Wish we were in person, but this is pretty great. So I did say that. I said that a long time ago about made, not found, and I think it kind of came from the decades of work that the MacArthur Foundation had done as an impact investor, but especially an affordable housing initiative that we mounted in the late 1990s for about 20 years, focused on preserving and improving affordable rental housing across the United States. And I would say that wasn't conceived as a gender lens investment strategy, but there was a majority of the occupants of the housing, tens and tens of thousands of women, were the beneficiaries. There were senior citizens on low income, fixed income, there were single parents and so forth. And research that we and others funded over the years showed that without stable, affordable housing, people cannot take care of their children, find jobs, get an education, and achieve the level of wellness and potential that we hope everyone can find. So that was really the work that gave rise to our experience in blended finance, creating funds like the New York Housing Fund that had 7 foundations in a first loss layer, 2 public agencies even below that, and then a 23 institution senior capital pool to create a vehicle for filling a gap. But a more recent example that really is squarely in the theme of this conference is one really that for us was catalyzed in a big way by Kennyarth. They had made earlier commitments to 1 Acre Fund, which came to MacArthur Foundation in the context of our Catalytic Capital Consortium, that is a mouthful, C3 initiative. And the reason we think of that as a gender lens or gender relevant investment is that of the 1 million+ people, the farmers in predominantly Rwanda and Kenya that have been served and who have benefited and seen their incomes grow, the majority, not the totality, but the majority are women. And they've seen, 40+% increases in their income as a result of not just financing, but also training and technical assistance. And I think I heard that at the tail end of the last conversation, and we'll come back to that. Capital is essential, but not necessarily always, investment capital is not necessarily the whole story. Just very quickly in terms of the blended finance structure, because I assume people who come to this conference are actually interested in some things that many of our colleagues find a little bit baffling. So that structure has a first loss layer. MacArthur has invested 10 million. The total layer is about $21 million. There is a guarantee backstopping 50% of that first loss layer. And there is an ambition to unlock about 100 million in commercial funds on the strength of that first loss tranche. And I would just close to go back to the made not found. This is an example of something where it's hard to do this financing because it's really hard. I mean, they are making loans that are often less than $100 a piece. These are some of the poorest people in the world. They are remote and hard to reach. So the economics of what 1 Acre is doing is just intrinsically difficult and not something that is necessarily going to be solved by your run-of-the-mills, plain vanilla, sitting right out there in plain sight commercial banking solution. And I think everyone who gets involved in blended finance realizes that sometimes to bridge capital gaps is hard and takes a lot of problem solving and iteration, but can in fact make impact possible that would not otherwise happen.
Thanks, Deborah. So, one thing I like about that quote, "the made not found," is that it implies intentionality, right? It's things don't just happen. You talked about, your work being gender relevant, but, there's also that, we have to make it happen. And, Diane, a few years ago, you talked about, adopting, very actively the moniker of being a gender lens investor. So I'd like to hear a bit more. We'd like to hear a bit more about how has Kennyarth evolved since, putting that, I don't want to call it a stick in the sand, but sort of that very intentional approach. How has it impacted and influenced your investment strategy, the use of catalytic capital, and even your operations to more effectively support the field of gender lens investing? And can you give an example? Yep. And you're on mute, Deborah, or Diane, excuse me.
Okay, apologies. When I started to think about that question, I actually realized I don't feel that our investment strategy has changed all that much. And actually positively, what I do feel is that the broader investment world has changed. And I feel that this has really created additional opportunities for us to collaborate with a lot of new partners and to accelerate investment in an outsized way that's going to benefit women and girls. And this specific initiative that I really wanted to talk about actually is the 2X challenge that was launched by the G7 DFI's development finance institutions in 2018. And when I look at how our investments have changed, a lot of where we can go has been driven by the 2X challenge. So the framework, I believe, is becoming much more mainstream. I feel it's similar to the Impact Management Project, IRIS. A lot of people have heard of it, a lot of institutions, a lot of funds. And on a personal level, we've integrated it into our diligence screen and many of our funds, and actually an increasing number of the companies that we work with are also in using the framework. So for us, it works as a screening tool. We have a scorecard that we've developed with it, and it's really determines the clear criteria of whether something is investable for us. So it also serves as a yardstick for us, and also to our investees to measure their progress and really to ensure accountability. And I really believe, as a majority or all the DFIs have signed up for it, and I believe it's becoming an integral part of carve-outs in other institutional investors, including pension funds, that this is no longer just going to be narrative, that there's going to have to be, real meat behind this, both for funds and for companies. So that's sort of the bigger, what I believe has had the greatest impact on us as an organization. The example that I'm going to give for investee, and we have numerous investees, I am very proud to say, that have met the 2X criteria, and also the DFC have their own 2X program, and a number of our investees have partnered with them. But the organization that I'd like to focus on is Root Capital. Root Capital also focuses on agricultural enterprises, and it really provides credit, and as Deb was alluding to, capacity building. So the technical assistance piece equally as important to small and growing businesses, in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, and tends to go work with that size of business who, again, can't access any other sort of funding, in that sort of desert that still exists. So we've been lending to Root Capital since 2014. Our most recent investment in 2019 was a $3 million 10-year subordinate debt at 2%. And basically it's used to attract more senior debt. So it really helps them to leverage dollars. Additional dollars. We often sit in that role. That tends to be the place we end up. Root Capital also has been working as a long-term partner with DFC. DFC has invested over $26 million with Root Capital since 2011. And these loans now qualify as part of the 2X challenge. And when I was reading a little more about what has this meant to Root, it's really quite dramatic, the work that they've been able to accelerate around gender lens because of being able to be part of the 2X challenge and being able to get that extra, money and technical assistance. I know that they're working both with the Walmart Foundation and with Visa Foundation. I think in combination, it's something like $27 million. It's very specific for women-led businesses, but on a more sort of granular, and I think often equally more important aspect of this, and I think that Gwen's going to allude to this, the getting women to participate in the workforce in communities where often that is not normative, is a big barrier to both access and opportunity for women. And one thing that they had realized was the trainings, when they were putting on trainings for their investee companies, women were not showing up. So they developed a very strategic plan and policy to give practical, access to women, to make sure that women actually were able to come to trainings. And that was done in 2021. And over the year of 2021, they had 36% of the participants were women. And that was a 30% increase over the previous year in workshops. So I think that, and there were just numerous examples. And they have a very ambitious, strategic gender equity plan for 2025 with specific targets, 130 million of financing, reaching out to 350 women leaders in agricultural enterprises, to really help build female leadership, train over 100 businesses in the importance of gender inclusion. So I felt like they're a good example, and, we're really delighted with the 2X challenge.
Thanks, Diane. So, the word outside sort of sticks in my mind from how you opened up the conversation. And, when we think of USAID, USAID is the largest donor in the world and has supported numerous projects to catalyze, invest, and others to strengthen the gender lens investing ecosystem. And also to support blended finance approaches for women's economic empowerment. So I'd love to hear a bit, Gwen, if you could share with us some of the examples of the work that USAID is doing in this space.
Sure. Thanks, Noemi. So USAID has done really several really cool things in terms of blended finance, and I think has really been a vanguard in blended finance models in emerging markets. So one great example to how USAID is contributing to strengthening the GLI ecosystem, and then also supporting the use of blended finance as an approach to strengthen women's economic empowerment is the Women's Livelihood Bond. So this is currently providing more than 2 million Southeast Asian women with access to credit. And it's also enhanced linkages to supply chains and affordable goods and services to improve their livelihoods. The $100 million bond, it's going to benefit women in Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And the U.S. Agency for International Development, they stepped in partnership with Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to guarantee 50% of the loan portfolio's principal. So this backing has catalyzed private sector investors to also support the bond series. And what the implementing partner has shared with USAID is that they actually had private sector investors come to them and say, we would not get into this bond. It would be too risky for us to do without the backing of federal governments, without the backing of the US government, and without the backing of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And so in part, this key component of blended finance for USAID is to not just de-risk, but spread the risk out among both the private sector, and the public sector. So the bond, which is structured and managed by Impact Investment Exchange, it's one of the world's first social sustainability bonds with a focus on both social and financial returns. And so what we really want to do here, at the end of the day, we don't want USAID to need to exist. We don't want USAID to have to step in order to de-risk these bonds. It's fine we're doing it now. We're happy to do it. We're proud to do it, and we want to do it. But we also want to reach that point and really accelerate reaching that point where these products, especially these financial vehicles and these alternative financing vehicles for women who don't have the traditional means of collateral, which is mostly land, that they can access these financial products and services because they're mainstream, because they're widely available at banks in emerging markets, and they are simply part of the traditional products that are offered. And they're not a niche market, and it is not and it doesn't require, the involvement and the backing of, country governments. So that's really what we're going for, kind of if we were to zoom out and look at what are we trying to achieve here. In the immediate term, yes, it's absolutely to get financing into the hands of women in developing countries who need it most. And if we zoom out in the long term, it's also so those very same financial products and services would be available or will be available to these women without the backing of federal governments.
Great, thank you, Gwen. So shifting a little bit, you talked about access, Gwen, and access also means at a very localized level, no? And what I think we're all ultimately aiming for is to increase women's access to capital, particularly in areas that are underserved by the existing financial products. So Diane, blended finance has been criticized for not focusing on the poorest countries or the least developed economies. And you've spoken about how it's important, how patient capital is important, and how we have to take a longer term view to support women or poor women in emerging markets. So how have Kenya Arts investments helped to mobilize grant makers, other investors that might have different risk appetites to adopt this more patient approach?
So as you've sort of stated, basically the overwhelming majority of our blended finance deals really focus on reducing the cost of capital in order to serve the poorest and most vulnerable communities, because that is our committed focus area. This generally means often, but not always, we are in the Women's World Livelihood Bond, and obviously we have downside protection on that one. So we've benefited from USAID, AID, and the Australian government. But in general, we play that junior first loss role and help to mitigate risk, reduce the cost of capital, and also enable other players who really are unable to, often for their fiduciary responsibilities that we don't have, take that kind of risk. The example that I wanted to use for this question is global partnerships. We've lent over $10 million to global partnerships over the past probably 7 years. They're a US-based nonprofit, impact first, like we are. And the main reason that we have been able to have this enduring partnership with them is because of their women-centered investment initiatives, their very, very thoughtful impact assessment, and their absolute commitment to the poorest communities in the world. I was able to witness firsthand what it looked like for women in Guatemala who were able to receive loans as part of their women-centered finance with education initiative. And this was through a nonprofit, which is also an MFI, called Friendship Bridge. And it was really an extraordinary experience. We were, in a very rural area. About 8 Guatemalan women in traditional dress came in between the ages of about 16 and 55. You could tell there was a lot of banter, a lot of mentorship from the older women with the younger women. That was part of, some of them had just been, this was their first loan cycle, the younger women, some of the women, this was like their 10th loan cycle. There was a very lively class that was basically on profit and loss. And there was a very young, ambitious young woman who had a small perfumery business that she was selling at the markets, who really was incredibly enthusiastic, and you could tell had really grasped these concepts in a very sophisticated way, although she was semi-literate. So they were also teaching appropriately, obviously in the indigenous language. So we had double translation going on, and the materials were, suited for the women. What was interesting at the end, I almost had forgotten that this was a repayment meeting. I was so kind of swept up in what these women were learning and how they were reacting to it. And at the end, people, paid back in. And then 2 women went off to put the money into the local branch of the bank. And we were told that this was absolutely revolutionary. The thought of 2 indigenous women walking into a mainstream bank to actually deposit their money would have been unheard of. And it was part of this MFI's sort of mission and strategy to help these women really feel comfortable in, in the mainstream banking world, with the, again, a bit like when quite far off reality of them being able to bank there, but that being, a real objective. Complementary to this, later on, through Friendship Bridges, we met a woman who had cervical cancer. There is quite a high prevalence of cervical cancer amongst the indigenous communities in Central America and Guatemala as well. And she was able to access SMEAR through a nonprofit healthcare program that had partnered with Friendship Bridge. And she was also able to get support, additional support from Friendship Bridge, financial support through this whole health crisis. And that is a service that Friendship Bridge gives to women who take out loans. So when you take out a loan, you also have access to healthcare screening. So I guess what I want to sort of emphasize is that not all MFIs are the same. Not all intermediaries who provide money to MFIs are the same. And one of the reasons that we absolutely have a deep commitment to global partnerships is they're exceptional in finding these incredible long-term partner organizations who do so much more than just loan money to the most marginalized, in these communities. So again, I guess our investment to get around to that. There are two funds that we've been instrumental in. There's the first one is a $55 million fund called the Impact First Development Fund that was launched in 2018 with the sole purpose of really lowering the cost of capital to enable them to get deeper and work with even more marginalized people and communities. And we were able to leverage 5 million sub-debt from us, subordinate debt, sort of more equity-like, was leveraged $50 million from the DFC. So we call that the Kenny Arth Unicorn, which we're very proud of. And we did that alongside Kellogg Foundation and actually Global Partnerships themselves. And the most recent fund is the First Growth Fund, which closed just in August of last year. And that really is focusing on helping with, COVID, resilience for their partners who really need, that additional, long-term, low-cost capital. That too came out, both of those funds came out at a blended rate of 2% for global partnerships. So, that you just realize with the spread, they can then really lend at a very low cost to their partner organizations. Again, we put in 3 million first loss in that fund. And I believe the DFC put in, I think around 30 million. It's a $45.5 million fund. And we put in that subordinate debt with the Shelby Cullum Davis Charitable Fund.
Thanks, Dan. So Gwen, we'll hop over to you. I know that blended finance and gender loans investing are really only a small part of what USAID is doing to promote women's economic empowerment. So I'd love to switch it a bit and see how, what is some of the work that you're doing, other work you're doing to increase women's access to finance, particularly poor women, women of color, women in Indigenous communities. And what is the role of blended finance and catalytic capital, which sometimes feels like it's up here, when in fact, USAID's goal is to impact that very local level, such as what Diane was just sharing with us.
No, it's a great question, Noemi. And so I would say, yes, there is definitely a role for blended finance and catalytic capital to really help reach, women in more marginalized communities in emerging markets. And that can include women in Indigenous communities, disabled women. It can even include LGBTQI. And so it really can, we really want to, I would say, equalize, the opportunities, across the board, in part through, blended finance. And so, for example, USAID is partnering with Banco de América Central in El Salvador to help Indigenous women and women in, smaller, remote, rural, communities that don't have ready access, to finance, to expand the variable payment obligation, programs, these VPOs of, some of these banks in these communities. And so this is a program that aims to expand access to finance for small and growing businesses in these more remote and rural communities, and Indigenous women, definitely, in these communities, as well as persons of color, with a type of loan that assesses the risk and repayment, through the variable payments and the cash flow of these businesses. that these women have rather than through traditional assets. And also maybe assets that an Indigenous woman or a person of color, does not have. And through either systemic bias and social norms and gender norms, and again, a lack of, collateral. And so this is really critical that women have these non-traditional options to access collateral in order to, grow their business, in these, Indigenous, communities, which oftentimes, their livelihood really does, depend on them being able to, access these financing alternatives. And so really what this has done in El Salvador, it's really provided them with greater access to financing because the loan product has these soft collateral requirements and repayment schedule that tracks the business's cash flow, in contrast to these standard loans that often require these upfront collateral. And so this has really been crucial to getting increased financing to these Indigenous populations, especially populations that are experiencing large migration flows, and also populations in communities in Central America, in El Salvador, where upwards of 80% of the population either works in the informal industry, and so that means they're not in the formal economy. They're not receiving benefits, and they really don't have access to these more traditional means of obtaining financing. And so it's really also, I think, trying to develop products that are blended finance with the backing of USAID to reflect where women and men work in these communities, what types of jobs they have, and really what they need to help grow their businesses, and especially in these conflict areas and these areas that are experiencing either economic crises or even economic shocks.
Thanks, Gwen. It's always encouraging to hear about these different approaches for more inclusionary banking, in particular in difficult areas such as El Salvador, which USAID is supporting. So Deborah, we spoke in our conversation prior to this. We spoke about inclusionary banking and some of the work that MacArthur is doing, particularly in communities of color. So bringing it back domestically, you had mentioned some work that you've done in North Carolina. I believe the organization was Self-Help, and how it's helped increase access to mortgages and home ownership for Black and Brown women, many of them who are single mothers. So if you could please elaborate a bit on that blended finance approach, and how is it different, or how was it different from your more traditional blended finance approaches?
Thanks, Noemi. Happy to speak about Self-Help. This is a very long established community development financial institution in the US, headquartered, as you said, in North Carolina, but with a national reach and major footprint in California, Illinois, North Carolina, and Georgia. And through their secondary mortgage program, which began in the 1990s, just after MacArthur's, before I started doing impact investing at MacArthur, and just after the first, I think, $1 million loan to that organization in the late 80s, the secondary mortgage program actually reached across the country because they partnered with major conventional lenders. And what they were aiming to do with that, and it's still ongoing today. I don't actually have a current number because it's not something that we've been tracking regularly. Our loan to Self-Help, which preceded the creation of the national program, which was like a pilot or demonstration, that loan has been repaid many years ago. So they're not required to report to us on it daily. But I know that it reached far north of 50,000 plus households. And that was, I think, about 10 years ago. The structure of the program is not a closed blended finance fund the way that we normally think of the layer cake, or sometimes we call it lasagna finance, where we're all in these different levels. This is really a good reminder that blended finance happens in a lot of ways because Self-Help is an open fund. And so they take in loans from foundations and family offices and others on catalytic terms. But they also bring in layers of financing from senior lenders. So inside the organization, you're seeing levels of blending and layering based on risk and cost of funds. And grants too can also play a role. There was a $50 million grant from the Ford Foundation that really allowed them to scale this mortgage program. It did prioritize homeowners, in particular women and other households that had been heavily impacted by racial discrimination, as well as the blemishes of healthcare credit problems, because we all know that in the healthcare industry, they can be quick to really damage people's credit through very aggressive collection measures. And what self-help did and continues to do is to allow for some special underwriting around those healthcare related credit blemishes. And then after the foreclosure crisis, to allow some flexibility on foreclosure related credit issues. This is a reminder that sometimes blended finance and catalytic capital can be important, not just where the economics are not favorable or are very tough, but also in these situations where there are some structural factors where the risk of those factors is poorly understood, or where there is frankly just mispricing of risk. So they've had this program for a long, long time. The way our PRI is currently, we've total supported self-help over the decades with almost $40 million in program-related investments. Much of the early loans have been paid back, but after the foreclosure crisis, we provided a loan, for example, to help revive the largest Latinx serving credit union and bank in Chicago, in the region, and where there were literally hundreds of families who were at risk of foreclosure. And when self-help came in, they were able to rework those mortgages and keep those families in stable situations. We provide a loan to something called their Ventures Fund. The Ventures Fund invests equity into their credit unions. The credit unions can then use that equity base to bring in deposits, which are the main form of conventional, if you will, capital. So there's blending happening, but it's not happening inside one closed fund. And so that's a complicated example. I do want to mention another way that catalytic capital and gender lens investing and empowerment of women is also happening. So for us, we have 3 funds that I would just call out, all of which have major focus on helping women entrepreneurs. In 2 cases in developing emerging market context. Encore is a women-led fund in India. Alive Ventures is focused on Latin America, a few countries in particular, and has a partnership with something that I do not know personally, because I'm not personally and deeply involved in this particular transaction, but they're working with something called Value for Women. And they have a very explicit, and Diane's laughing at me because I don't know who that is, but my program officer said, be sure to mention.
No, I'm not laughing at you because of that, but you've stolen my thunder.
Oh no,
that's why I'm laughing at you. No, it's fine because
it's all good.
Like lines go to the same place.
They all do. So Alive is a venture fund. They are partnering with Value for Women because they've integrated gender lens perspective into all aspects of their investment operation. And one of the companies that they've invested in is called Simplifica, and they are managing a payroll management solution platform that tries to help domestic workers formalize their employment. We have another fund that's also a venture fund called Impact America, and they have invested in a company called Care Academy, using an online platform to deliver training to home health workers and other care providers, with an explicit goal of helping those providers upskill and improve their career and their income potential. So those are 3 examples of venture funds. So there's no blending. They're all catalytic in our nomenclature, but incredible levels of intentionality, and they're filling gaps and bringing backing to women serving organizations that I think would not probably be able to grow and accelerate without that capital.
Thanks, Deborah. So I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end. But I want to get at something I think that we all think about, and that's big change. It's structural change. And Gwen, I'm going to start off with something you said in our conversation recently, which was we need to focus on systemic change across the entire finance industry to truly improve women's economic empowerment globally. Mm-hmm. How is USAID as this large donor and agency catalyzing this change?
Mm-hmm. It's really doing, a lot. I think one program that, I did want to highlight that really shows how USAID is seeking to influence entire industries is its Engendering Industries program. And so this is a program that was launched in 2015. It started out as focused on utilities. So it was actually called Engendering Utilities. And it sought to work with private sector companies in emerging markets and really large companies. For example, in Mozambique, the utilities industry, it's the largest employer in the country. And so it wanted to work with these companies to raise up gender champions and gender allies in the companies that participated in the Engendering Industries program. So they actually came to Georgetown University, and with technical support and funding by USAID and also, by Georgetown and several other sponsors, they developed business plans to present a viable business model on how companies in the utilities industry, and then it expanded to energy and to water, and now we're in financial services, could really influence all of these policies from hiring and recruiting all the way to promoting and retaining women in positions. And the real idea behind this model of systemic change was to get women into really good paying jobs, decent work at all levels of a corporation. Not just entry level and not just a very, very few at the leadership or the boardroom, but literally from branch managers to the boardroom, for example, from bank tellers, all the way up to, a vice chairman, of MasterCard, Ann Carnes, who's a wonderful, woman who champions, women in finance, to get these women involved in all of these levels. But it really takes intentional strategic work at large, these large multinational companies, and develop these gender champions, within, and then have them really kind of fan out, both throughout their company and then into, other companies in a sector. And then most recently, USAID has partnered with CGAP. They have a FinEquity platform that consists of over 2,500 members in financial services and institutions. And we're working with them to take key aspects of the Engendering Industries model and apply it to, financial services. And then Engendering Industries, it really is seeking to hone in on male-dominated industries and how to get more women into the employment cycle of those industries at all levels. And so we're working with FinEquity to take some of the materials that were developed, for the Engendering Industries program and really tailor it to the financial services, industry, and then work with them on how they can really influence this platform, this membership platform that they have, in order to inspire and catalyze the members who work in financial institutions to really go into their institutions and advocate for policies and changes that and really, it can be everything from on-site child care to more flexible professional part-time jobs. To really keep and retain these, these women, in these industries, because if we do that, and it's, I think the starfish model is so, pertaining to this. If we just do it one at a time, and then you fast forward, Engendering Utilities has been around now, for 7 years, And we're really starting to see impact in some of these male-dominated industries. So I think that's a great example of what USAID is doing.
Thanks, Gwen. So, Deborah, the MacArthur Foundation has the resources, the networks, and the ability to influence the impact investing system. For example, you mentioned in the beginning the C3, the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which is a learning and investment and initiative to bring together different impact investors. So how do you hope, whether it's through that initiative or other initiatives that the MacArthur Foundation is pushing forward, how are you contributing to moving the dial when it comes to this area and really bringing about systemic change?
Thank you, Noemi. Well, I think this conversation just underscores when you hear about the investments that Kenny Earth has made. I'm very proud of the investments that we've made, which if people want to know anything about them, they're on our website at macfound.org, and all the amazing work that USAID and other DFIs around the world are doing. It's clear that catalytic capital plays an essential role in advancing women's empowerment. That's not its only function or job in this world, but it is hard to think about how Indigenous women can be in that situation of making that bank deposit, if all we were relying on was commercial market rate capital by itself. To Gwen's point, many of these things are innovative and novel, and as they prove out, like we hope with the Women's Bond, over time, market rate capital will come in and you won't need the blended approach. Not everything, though. So sometimes the gaps we face in the market are structural. And unless you think poverty is going to end sometime in our lifetimes, there will always be the gaps created by just the lack of resources. So innovation, the populations, the places, all these things come together to create a need for a spectrum of capital. And our initiative and our field support work is all about building an impact investing field that is inclusive and that is balanced, where we don't fall into the what we believe to be a misguided notion that all we need is the market rate capital alone. That is essential. These problems are huge. The SDG gaps are huge. We must mobilize private capital. Do not get me wrong. But we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that that's going to happen by itself. And again, this conversation, this whole conference really underscores the way that we need capital from all ends of the spectrum. We need all tools. We don't need just investment capital, right? We need grants. We need also public policy in all the sectors that we work in. And we also need businesses that engage through their sustainability work, or in the ways, Gwen, that you were just describing, in the ways that they transform their organizations, their culture, and their practices. So we need research, we need policy, we need investment, we need entrepreneurship, and that needs to span business, NGO, social innovator. There's no one answer. So we're very much about problem first, tool second, and let's make sure we have all the tools possible on the table.
Thanks, Deborah. And I'm going to round this out with you, Diane. So if you remember when we were talking about systemic change a few weeks ago, you humbly said that Seniorth is just a small private family office that doesn't have that kind of impact. But the two of us, so all of us here, Gwen and Deborah, sort of shaking our heads, like in disagreement with what you said. Because when you start to talk about your work, and you hinted at this, or you brought that up when you talked about the work in Guatemala, I mean, you are having an impact. It's those starfish, it's these little things that all of us, that contribute to this broader systemic change. Whether it is, you talked about work that you've done to make workplaces more accessible, creating products and services that positively impact women, and you've challenged business as usual approaches through the types of investments that you make. So being a little less humble, please share with us something that you're proud of and how you have contributed to that bigger impact and to changing systems.
Thank you. I wouldn't say that we don't have impact. I just don't feel like we drive the agenda. So I guess I do feel some of the larger institutions do, and we fit in where we can. So to kind of clarify my viewpoint on that. And I have tremendous admiration both for MacArthur Foundation and for the work that AID is doing. And they're really a necessity for organizations like us who play the role that we play. One of the things that I think dovetails really well with both what Debs and Gwen have said, is really the work that we have done directly with our portfolio companies around their gender lens practice. And the reason that I was smiling when Debs mentioned value for women was that in 2020, we did an in-house research project with 20 of our portfolio companies. This is for our direct loans, not with funds, to get a feel for their view, their gender lens practice, their views on what they needed. And we concluded that the best thing for us to do would be to commission a specialized advisory service, Values for Women, which is a firm that helps organizations advance gender lens inclusion in their work. So we did that. The first step was for them to complete a survey, which basically is a gender scorecard that helps them to identify basically, their strengths and then really where their gaps are. And they had a follow-up webinar, and then one-to-ones for them to prioritize what changes they wanted to implement. We already have several portfolio companies that had worked quite in depth with Values for Women. Apollo, which is an agricultural inputs company that really works from a very high-tech, it's the polar opposite of 1 Acre Fund, so they're using satellite data and other high touch points to assess credit so that they don't have that deep hands-on relationship that 1 Acre Fund has, to really try and see if you can bring down the price points of farmers having these very small packets of inputs, because as Deb's referred to 1 Acre Fund, these loans are really, really teeny. And the cost is so disproportionate to the loan amount. Any strategy to lower that cost is really vital. And 1 Acre Fund actually have worked extensively with Values for Women to really help to develop very, very clear targeted strategies where they have, outcomes that they are measuring and they're holding themselves accountable. So this is a huge movement, a little bit like the 1 by 1 that Gwen was referring to. I feel like there's starting to be, almost a sea change around this. I also wanted to say that we have other partners, and I wanted to point out one fund in particular. It's a relatively small fund, but they provide debt for a lot of the types of companies that we do. They're called Alpha Mundi, and they have a foundation, the Alpha Mundi Foundation, and they have a technical assistance facility that's very specific to gender lens work that they provide to their portfolio companies. And they also have set something up called the Gender Smart Enterprise Assistance Research Coalition. And they work with one of the Kenny Arth investees is Root Capital, but with Acumen and with a whole number of other really quite important players in the impact space to support each other's gender lens work. So, I do feel like there is already an understanding within portfolio companies that not only is this a necessity because, it's the right thing to do, it's necessary because they need, from within their organizations, as Gwen was referring, they need to have a robust workforce that is able to retain women, support women in order to build better businesses. And they need to be able to create women-centric products in order to grow their businesses. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic about that based on the investments we have and the portfolio companies that we have.
Thanks, Tan. So we've got 5 minutes left, and we have one question in the chat. And Deborah, I'm going to direct this one to you because in reference to your lasagna comment, this one says, many of the examples include, and this is related to catalytic capital, many of the examples include multiple providers of catalytic capital. How has this been helpful? And have there been differences in the hope for impact of catalytic capital?
I'm really glad that that question came to light because, the essence of doing these kinds of blended finance deals, whether you refer to them as lasagna or something, or layer cake or whatever it is, but anything where you're bringing a group of investors together into a closed structure where everybody's got to agree on a whole set of different trade-offs and roles, and figure out a way to get to the goal, which is a pool of capital that solves whatever problem you're working on. So the capital's got to be able to deploy in the right size, either bigger or smaller than might otherwise be possible, with the right cost of funds to be workable and suitable for the recipients. It's got to have the right duration, right? There's all these different factors that you have to shape. Well, that is fundamentally a collaboration. And we all know in the social sector that we're never going to make progress on any of these problems that we face, whether it's women's empowerment or all the subsidiary challenges that feed into difficulty for women trying to just make a life and realize their potential and live and raise their children as they wish. We know that we need collaboration to get there. We need it across the sectors, public, private, NGO, hybrid. We need collaboration among investors, and we're so grateful to be able to partner with Diane and Greg at Kennyarth and with our partners at so many other family offices, foundations, and corporations. But absolutely, it is difficult because just as you have to negotiate between the senior and subordinate layer, this question is really saying, well, what about within? What about within the catalytic layer? I will go back to the first example I cited, which was the New York Housing Fund. We launched that in 2005, and it was the product of a very long development period, very long, because there were so many players. And there was a point in time where we brought 7 foundations together to be the subordinated debt. And we had all of the lawyers from all of the foundations together on a long series of phone calls. And they had to all agree on what was charitable, because for a US private foundation that is making a program related investment, it has to meet the IRS definition of charitable. And not everybody defines charitable in exactly the same way. And some of the definitions would have proven, I think, a little bit more restrictive than some of us wanted to see for the folks that had to implement. And maybe you have others that think it didn't go far enough. So that would be an example, and you negotiate and you find your way to a solution. But it is always time consuming because you have a lot of parties with a lot of different restraints. Diane mentioned fiduciary duty. There can be a lot of different challenges baked in.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. So it's your time. So I'm going to wrap up your final collaboration, and that's important. Where this is blended
collaboration is key. There you go.
Across research and different entities and everyone here. So takeaway. Diane, a couple very quick takeaway that you would like to leave the audience with.
Basically, I have a plea for other high net worths and family offices, private foundations who have the fiduciary flexibility that we have, and I know you have, to use it, because we are really powerful in that we're really needed for the kinds of things that both Debs and Gwen is talking about. So please, if you're on this call, think about how important your money, how much more catalytic, how much more important your money can be.
Thanks, Diane. And Gwen, wrap up words from USAID.
Sure. I just wanted to, I guess, thank you, Noemi, for this opportunity to talk about some really exciting programs and activities that USAID has, and anyone who's interested in having, another conversation or multiple conversations with us about catalytic financing and alternative financing vehicles, please come talk to us. We really want to, we won't go, we're not really cutting edge, but if something's proven and if there really is, evidence-based, I would say research or results around a particular financing vehicle, again, we'd love to hear from you. So I guess the door is always open at USAID. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. All right, our last 50 seconds. So thank you to our panelists for the time and experience and your insights. It's been a pleasure collaborating with you on the session. Thanks, Kia, for all your work going into this. It's been seamless, which means that there's a lot of work that has gone on behind the scenes. So kudos to you for this, for pulling off this virtual event. And of course, thank you to USAID for all the support you've given to advance women's economic empowerment and for partnering with many of us who are on this panel, but also part of this forum. So have a great rest of the day to all, and see you in the closing session, and be well.
Thank you, Noemi.
Thank you, Noemi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noemi, Deborah, Gwen, and Diane for closing out the forum with such a lively, insightful, and candid conversation. There is such a collaborative spirit throughout your discussions, and I think that is so critical as we carry out this impact work. And thank you to everyone who has joined the Gender Equity and Financial Inclusion Forum over these past 3 days, and a special note of appreciation to USAID for its support of this forum. We would highly value your feedback on this forum, and we have dropped a survey link in the chat box, so please do fill it out. It's clear as a community, we have much to do to tackle the challenges hindering gender equity in all corners of the world. But I'm even more optimistic and inspired after participating in this forum with all of you. We have strength in numbers and committed stakeholders across the financial inclusion industry. Of those stakeholders, I especially want to recognize women leaders from financial service providers and social enterprises who are not satisfied with the status quo and are driving many trailblazing work. They take the time to really listen to their clients, develop and implement new products and services that works better for them, and advocate for women representation at their organizations to unlock the untapped capacity and the potential of women in their communities. Over my career, I felt so grateful for the opportunity to meet and engage with these inspirational leaders, and even more so, the women clients they serve around the world. Despite the cultural norms and other enormous barriers, I've always been in awe with how much these women have achieved against these challenges, and I can only imagine how much more they could accomplish if these barriers were lowered or even removed. That's what inspires and drives me in my work and my main reason for joining the GEFI team with its unapologetic focus to be impact first in all that we do. At GEFI, we envision a world where all people hold the power to create opportunity for themselves and for others. And I know that's a shared vision for those of you joining us today. Thank you again for your time in participating in the Gender Equity and Financial Inclusion Forum. And more importantly, thank you for your continued efforts as we collectively advance women's economic empowerment together. Bye-bye.